Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Unfortunately, it's in English, and I've been told to speak slower for the translator. I said to him this morning was very slow for me, so we'll have to be almost sleeping. So, what place for balanced solutions in 2014? These are the disclosures that we have to make, none of which are really relevant to this talk. So, do we need balanced solutions? I noticed that this elephant on the beach ball is being used by one of the companies to promote their balanced solutions. So I should have patented the picture that's the next. So we have plenty of solutions to choose from. So what's wrong with the ones we already have? Well, we know there are problems with some. I'm going to talk about this very quickly. Hydroxyethyl starch, still used in quite a few countries. This was data from last year. You can see France just beating Great Britain, as they do in most things these days, including the rugby, but nowhere near Switzerland. And you can see America, Hong Kong and Australia don't use starches at all. And from the renal point of view, there are quite a few complications with starches. There's the problems with the skin, and I will show my French prowess here. Okay, so there's a number of hands, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? It's an odd number of hands. I don't know where the next one is. And you can also perhaps have problems with synthetic colloids with BSE, not that it's been shown. And of course, from the renal point of view, it's the accumulation of starches in the tubular lysosomes which lead to damage. And synthetic colloids and the kidney have shown some increased risk. SOAP study, but there was no increased risk of acute kidney injury in the SOAP study. In Christmas, no increased risk of acute kidney injury. But of course then we were faced with other studies on colloids and crystalloids, the 6S and the CHEST studies, and these revealed some interesting findings which I'm sure we'll hear about later. But if we compare the groups of the 6S and the CHEST, apart from the fact that 6S were mainly septic patients, this one was potato and this one was corn. I don't think we need to get into the dietary argument, but the vector in each was different. One used Ringer's acetate, whereas the other used saline. And you can see that the incidence of acute kidney injury was slightly different in both groups. So if I summarise this in a different way, so there was more acute kidney injury with HEST in 6S, and there was less in CHEST. But of course, then came the argument, one was in a balanced solution, one was in saline. So is that what we were seeing rather than a difference? So that leads on to the next point of argument, which is about saline. Saline as a resuscitative fluid, and apparently we all know that that's very bad for you these days, and certainly in the last few years there's been lots written about that. So let's just look at some of the studies that tell us that high chloride solutions are bad. This was from JAMA, from the year before last now, 2012, from Ronaldo Bellomo's group, which was, and it's important to look at the title, it's association between a chloride liberal versus chloride restrictive IV fluid strategy, and observed kidney injury in critically ill adults. It's also important to look at the design of the study, because what happened, there was a control period throughout the ITUs where any fluids could be used. So this was the control group between February and August 2008. Shows you how long these studies take to get to press, doesn't it really? So control period N equals 760. Then there was an education and preparation period within the same intensive care units. So there was this phase-out period where people were educated as to what solutions they were going to use, which clearly didn't include saline. And then the test period, or the intervention period, where you just had Hartmann's, Plasmolite, or albumin. Saline was given very rarely, but for specific reasons. So, not randomised, okay, a control period, phase-out period, and then an intervention period. And what did it show? Well, it showed in the intervention period, so where there was no saline, there was a slightly increased risk of injury, acute kidney injury as defined by the rifle criteria of injury and failure. There was also a slight increase in the number of patients receiving renal replacement therapy, although the triggers for renal replacement therapy weren't noted. Now, why was that effect observed? Well, it could have been a sodium effect, it could have been the more chloride in the first group, it could have been more buffer in the second group, or it could have been a Hawthorne effect, so techniques improved because people knew they were being watched. Okay? But what's really important, okay? If you or one of your loved ones are unfortunate enough to be admitted to intensive care, you want to know very important things, don't you? So if you look at the ICU mortality, no difference. Hospital mortality, no difference. Length of stay, either in the ICU or the hospital, no difference. And the need for long-term renal replacement therapy, no different. So what you may have, some might argue, is a transitory dilutional hypochloremic acidosis, which is treated with renal replacement therapy, when it might not need to be. So I'm not very convinced by that paper, but there are more. There's this one, which is often quoted. This is the big Plasmolite study from the States. Major complications, mortality and resource after open abdominal surgery. And of course, this was a retrospective study and compared major open abdominal surgery with patients receiving saline on their first day of surgery compared to those requiring a balanced crystalloid. And of course, they couldn't randomise this, so it was propensity matched. Now, when I was a medical student many years ago, Altman, you may know from the Bland-Altman plot, taught me as a student, and he said, the more complex the statistics, the less relevant the result. And it's something I've always kept here. So this describes the propensity analysis. Matching was performed using the Malan-Hanobis metric method, with the width of the caliper set at 25% of the standard deviation of the logit of the propensity score. I have no idea what that means, okay? So I just hope that the French translation made more sense, but I've got absolutely no idea what it meant. Now, what did the study show, right, this propensity match study? Well, it showed that there was more use of buffers if you use saline, and perhaps more use of renal replacement therapy. But when you look in the paper, right, you actually look at what is written, all multivariate models of acute renal failure demonstrated parameter estimates in the direction supporting balanced fluid use. In the direction, although none were statistically significant. Right? And that's actually quite important. Again, there was an increase in the need for, or the application of renal replacement therapy. And it's also worthwhile bearing in mind that some of the balanced solutions are quite expensive. So this is the standard rate for saline in America. It's $80 a bag, which I thought was actually quite a lot of money. There we go. $100 for lactated ringers and $200 for Plasmolite. So quite a significant difference. Then there's this study, which was in the same journal, which showed a randomized controlled double-blind crossover study on the effects of rapid infusion of saline and Plasmolite in healthy volunteers. So 2 litres given over, I think, 30 minutes. It was an MRI study, And what it showed is, not unreasonably, the patients with the individuals given the saline showed an increased risk of chloride. Well, the chloride concentration they were given was much higher. It also showed, something they don't talk about in the paper, that bicarbonate dropped quite precipitously, which would go along with a dilutional acidosis. And this was the mean renal artery flow velocity. That was also measured, which showed a decrease of hyperchloridemia. And some of you may have heard me talk about this morning that velocity and flow are somewhat different. As I said, little boys watering the garden will know that if you changed the aperture of your watering hose, you can change the velocity, but the flow remains much the same. And this is a rather complicated modelling on renal cortical tissue perfusion, and according to my MRI experts, depends which method you use. This study did look at biomarkers of kidney injury, which I thought was quite interesting, and there was no difference in NGAL. So apparently significant reduction in mean renal artery flow velocity, and also cortical perfusion in normal individuals given a high load of saline. And this has just come out, plasma versus 0.9% saline for fluid resuscitation in DKA. Numbers small, plasma light 9, normal saline 14, and I won't bore you with the results because you know what it'll show. Change in bicarbonate, unsurprisingly, but in terms of overall outcome, there was no difference in glycemic control or duration of intensive care unit study. So more expensive, doesn't make any difference. So where does the evidence that chloride is bad for you come from? Okay, we can look at several of those papers, and we can see the same thing is quoted over and over again. Okay? In denervated dog kidneys, intrarenal infusion of chloride-containing fluid, renal vasoconstriction. A possible explanation, blah, 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 vasoconstrictive effect. Not sodium chloride, vasoconstriction. They all refer to the same paper, which is this paper. So, rather unusually, I decided to read the original paper rather than just read all the quotes from it. So this was from the Journal of Clinical Investigation and published in 1983. That was even before I was at medical school, so that shows you how long ago that was. 48 greyhound dogs. Okay, I don't know. There must be a French for greyhound, but I don't know what it is. And the greyhounds had one of their kidneys transplanted to their neck, so as a consequence was denervated, and anastomosed to the carotid and the jugular. And then various fluids were infused directly via the renal artery, and they could measure renal blood flow, renal plasma flow, GFR, and filtration fraction. So, for a start, doesn't really look like our patients. They were also starved and mechanically ventilated, and the CO2 was kept somewhere between 4 and 6, but they weren't really sure because they didn't measure it. But it kept them at standard tidal volumes. So, also very different to our practice, or at least I hope so. These are the results. They're very difficult to read, and I don't expect you to read them from there, because I'll summarise them for you in a minute. But they looked at bicarbonate, sodium acetate, dextrose, ammonium acetate, sodium chloride, and ammonium chloride. And what did the results show? Well, these are the results from saline and ammonium chloride. I'll have to tell you, because you won't read it, but the amount of dogs given saline was 17. So a lot of this data quotes a paper that used 17 greyhound dogs. Okay? And that showed that if you gave the dogs, underfilled, starved dogs with a set tidal volume, a saline infusion, that their renal blood flow went down, their renal RPF also went down, their GFR fell, and the filtration fraction stayed about the same. So, I've summarised it on this slide, really. So, if the dogs were given bicarbonate, there was a bit of an improvement, but not much, really. If they were given sodium acetate, getting buffered, a bit more improvement, but not much. Ammonium acetate, no difference. Sodium chloride, okay, isosmolar, so sodium chloride there, reduction in all three. But ammonium chloride, the same chloride concentration, significant reduction in renal blood flow, renal plasma flow, GFR, and filtration fraction. Chloride concentration the same, but significant differences. So why is that? Well, I'll skip through that one. Within the paper, the authors actually write, suggests that the vasoconstriction effect is due to metabolic acidosis. Right? That's what they said. In the ammonium chloride, but not in the saline, which I find somewhat difficult to ascertain given the fact that the pH of the dogs was about the same. Also, interestingly, they say that Gerber, another paper on animal volumes, showed that if you used animals that were volume expanded, so not starved and not dry, and you gave them saline, you didn't see any renal vasoconstriction. No explanation is really given for that. So I'm supposed to talk about balanced solutions, so we'll get back to that now. So what of balanced solutions? Which fluid should we use? Well, it depends very much on the situation, I believe. So some of you may have realised from my surname that I have Italian origins, so I'm more than likely to eat this for dinner. Okay? So would I have it for dinner? But would I have it for breakfast? Probably not. Okay? So I'd have that for dinner, not for breakfast. And it's much the same with the fluids. What we want is the right amount of fluid, the right type, at the right time. Now, is there any evidence in all our clinical literature that behaviour like that improves matters? Well, there is, if you scratch deeply. If we look at some of the perioperative hemodynamic optimisation data, we find that you can protect renal function in surgical patients with adequate optimisation. And I'll show you some data here that used all manner of fluids. Some used saline, some used colloids, don't tell anyone that. Some used albumin, some used buffered solutions. And this was a meta-analysis of all these studies that reported post-operative acute kidney injury. And you can see that in most of the treatment arms, there is a tendency towards reducing acute kidney injury. There are a few outliers where acute kidney injury is less or favours the control, and I'm embarrassed to say one of those is my institution. So even though we have the renal experts, we still get more kidney injury. And this is the same thing defined by increase in serum creatinine and need of renal replacement therapy. And again, there is a trend towards less RRT with preoperative hemodynamic optimisation. And again, according to treatment, either fluids or fluids and inotropes, again, there's a tendency towards treatment. So, the overall pooled results show a significant reduction in renal impairment, in AKI and RRT, and of course, mortality. Now, this is blessed with the usual curses of a meta-analysis, but it does go some way to answering some of our questions. So the choice of fluid almost certainly depends on the clinical situation. So we need, as pointed out in this editorial, a balanced view regarding balanced solutions, and also in this excellent review, really, by John Myerberg and Monty Myson in the New England this year, who pointed out that there are over 200 million litres per year of saline used in the US. So I conclude that the data that I've already discussed suggests that a randomised controlled trial examining the safety and efficacy of saline as compared to a balanced salt solution is warranted. And I think we all agree with that. So, you may want to know what my practice is, for what it's worth, and this is what it is. Do I use colloids in my ITU? No. Do I use colloids in theatre? Well, some of my colleagues do sometimes, but we're trying to dissuade that. Albumin? Yes, I do. I use that sometimes. Do I use dextrose? Yes, I do. Do I use saline? Yes, I do. But do I use Hartmann's or balanced solutions? Actually, I use those most of the time. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.